Welcome back and welcome to our panel titled Exploring the Boundary Between Shelter and Housing. My name is Ariana Buchanan and I'm in my final year of law school at the University of Oregon. I am also a student member of HLA and a fellow at the law school's Environmental and Natural Resource Law Center. I am thrilled to be moderating this panel, and we've got three wonderful speakers with extensive knowledge on different housing models. First, we will hear from Eric Engstrom. Eric is a principal planner with the Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. He has been with the city of Portland for over 25 years, working on land use, transportation, and strategic planning projects. Then you will hear from Marc Fretz. Marc is a research assistant professor and associate director of outreach in the Department of Architecture at the University of Oregon and associate director of knowledge exchange at the Institute of Health in the Built Environment, which leverages design thinking and transdisciplinary science collaboration to develop and apply innovative design solutions for low carbon buildings and simultaneously promote individuals, communities, and the planet. And then third, we will hear from Marc Jolin, who is finishing his tenure as Director of Portland Joint Office of Homeless Services, a position he has served in since 2016. Over the past 25 years, Marc has worked as a case manager, program manager, organizer, a legal services attorney, and an executive of a street outreach program that works to house people experiencing chronic homelessness. After the panelists' presentations, I will be moderating the Q&A, and you can submit questions during any time during the presentations by clicking the Q&A button in the bottom corner of your Zoom screen. Okay, all right, I'll hand it over to Eric.
Thank you. I just want to say it's an honor to speak today. I'm excited about this. I'm going to speak to my experience over the last few years dealing with and learning about the continuum between shelter and housing from a city planner's perspective. And bear with me here while I share my screen. All right, can we see that? All right, thumbs up. Just briefly, some context, and probably Marc will go into this a little bit more, but Portland is experiencing a homelessness crisis. In 2019, there were over 4,000 people. Canada is experiencing homelessness in Portland, and with the economic downturn with COVID-19, that has placed many more people at risk. We didn't officially do a count last year, but I have no doubt that that number is significantly higher at this point. I'm going to talk about land use and zoning, but I just want to acknowledge there are other things affecting us right now in terms of how we deal with people living on the street. There was a significant court decision a while back that relates to the city's ability to regulate where people sleep in public spaces. There were also health guidelines during COVID that generally discouraged us from sweeping and moving people out of where they were camped. So that's a little bit of context. I'm going to focus on a project that the city brought forward in 2021 called the Shelter to Housing Continuum. And that was adopted in April of 2021 last year. It had a couple different components. We changed our zoning code and a couple other development codes in the city of Portland to do a couple things. We changed the rules, the zoning rules about homeless shelter facilities to acknowledge a new type of shelter facility called outdoor shelter, which responds to our experience over the last few years developing and permitting alternative shelter models. It provided more flexibility generally for shelter siting, even the traditional shelters. We also liberalized the group living allowances in the zoning code and changed how we deal with people living in RVs and homes on wheels in certain circumstances. The outdoor shelter is a concept, again, built off of some of the alternative village model shelters that a number of cities have experimented with over the last number of years. It is, as we've defined it in our zoning code, it's a shelter that's where people are sheltered in individual structures such as yurts or small huts or cabins, or potentially vehicles, as in the safe parking programs, where there's not generally cooking facilities or bathrooms within the structure where they're sleeping. It may include buildings that provide that sort of commons for kitchens or sanitary facilities, but generally people are sleeping in individual pods, if you will, or which could be a number of different kinds of structures. This is new and is dealing with, in part, building off of something that state statute authorized, and they called transitional housing accommodations. We specifically included vehicles in here in order to accommodate the concept of the safe parking programs, which is generally where there's a safe place for folks who are living in their vehicles to park at night. As I mentioned, these facilities could include food and hygiene facilities or other services. And the intent, kind of by definition, because these are considered a community service use category in our zoning, that these are run by public agencies or nonprofits or other similar institutions. And I'll get into a little bit that as I talk about the different zoning code categories for this kind of thing. We allowed this use in our commercial and employment zones and multifamily zones with a fairly loose upper limit on size, and then there's a more limited allowance in industrial zones, in part to respond to the Portland's limited supply of industrial land. So this definition is intended to include a variety of types of situations, including potentially tent facilities or facilities that are based on small self-built cabins. Generally, the thing that they all have in common is that the shelter is provided in something that isn't a building that's been fully reviewed as under building code and zoning as a building. This is just a photograph of inside the one of the sleeping structures in the Kenton Women's Village in North Portland, to give you an example of what that accommodation might look like for the user. St. John's Village, which opened in 2021, is another recent example of this kind of approach. This is a more formal version of it, where the cabins are actually designed and built together rather than self-built. But it generally shows the idea where there's a series of sleeping structures and then a common space for services or facilities. This code package also changed the city's rules about how we regulate institutional uses, and by that I primarily mean religious-based institutional uses like churches or synagogues or mosques. We changed our zoning code to allow that kind of use to also include shelters, including outdoor shelters, as an accessory to that use without having to reopen their conditional use permit. And in many cities, religious institutions are located in single dwelling zones and often are required to go through conditional use review. And when they change the nature of their services, they might have to update that permit. And this was a way of giving them more flexibility to add this use to their site without having to reopen that regulatory element. And the photo is of a small tiny house village in Southeast Portland on a religious site. As I mentioned, we also changed the city's code to as to how it deals with people sleeping in RVs and tiny houses on wheels. And this is about the private property side. It remains illegal to live in a vehicle in the public right of way in Portland, although there's certainly a lot of examples of that de facto happening right now. basically the city's nuisance code until now had prohibited residential occupancy of a vehicle on private property. And what we did is allow an individual residential site to host one occupied RV or tiny house. This is a little bit analogous to the ADU allowances that many cities are now required to have, but somewhat different in the sense that vehicles are not generally inspected by cities because they're not buildings, they're titled through the DMV. We did ask and impose a requirement for a campground style utility hookup for this use, and as one of the requirements, and there's a picture of that on the screen here with essentially a post with a plug, a spigot, and a utility port, similar to what you'd encounter at a campground. There are a few other places in Portland and in many other cities where people in RVs or tiny houses and wheels can also legally exist. Campgrounds are a commercial use in many zoning codes. RV parks exist, although are fairly uncommon, but that's generally something that zoning codes cover. We, of course, allow tiny homes without wheels attached to a foundation as accessory dwelling units or just their own primary structure. And then the state law allows some religious institutions to host people camping in vehicles as well. Marc may go into this more, but in 2021, after we adopted this code, the City Council adopted the Safe Rest Villages program, which is intended to create a set of outdoor shelters, not tent-based, but cabin-based. And there have been 6 sites identified by the city that will generally be arranged kind of how the diagram shows here on the screen, with a set of sleeping shelters and then some common hygiene and community space. So I want to talk a little bit about, shift gears now to group living. Group living is something that most zoning codes, including Portland, distinguishes from household living. When we talk about residential uses in zoning codes, generally residential use is categorized as either group living or household living. And it often includes things like congregate housing, boarding houses, co-housing facilities. SROs are in that category. Previously, before this sheltered housing code package in Portland, those kind of uses, those kind of residential uses were allowed in commercial and mixed use zones, but limited in multi-dwelling and a conditional use in single dwelling zones. We moved to a new system where we're allowing group living by right up to a certain size in single dwelling zones, and that size is designed to be comparable to the size of what we allow for residential households. And then we removed any limitations in the multi-dwelling zones. I put this slide in kind of tongue-in-cheek picture here that the concept of household living and group living goes back, I think, to historical attempts to really regulate the cultural makeup of neighborhoods, right? This is part of, along with redlining, the way that cities controlled the makeup of neighborhoods and excluded people from neighborhoods. And our old definition of household is printed on the screen here just to show it had been amended to acknowledge fair housing and to acknowledge different kinds of family relationships. But at the core, it was about distinguishing certain kind of living situations from others, from group living. So we've removed this definition from our zoning code and moved to a system where we're allowing group living, and we're defining it not by the relationships of the people, but by the type of building and space that is being constructed. And this gives you a little bit of a matrix of how our new code is organized, where household living is something that is occurring in a dwelling unit which could be a variety of types of dwelling units, and it generally is based on the number of bedrooms. So we're defining it as less than 8 bedrooms, and generally a dwelling unit has to have a kitchen and a bathroom and a complete set of facilities. Group living could be in a dwelling unit, but is generally provided when there's more than 9 bedrooms or 9 or more. And there are forms of group living that are not necessarily required to have kitchens, and bathrooms could end up being shared with multiple dwellings. So like an SRO is an example of that, where you have SRO buildings that don't necessarily have a kitchen with each unit. Again, so we're moving to a definition that is based on the building, not the people and their relationships to each other. This is important for a number of things, but SRO housing in particular has a history in Portland. Historically, we had a lot of very affordable single room occupancy buildings, especially in downtown Portland. We lost almost half of that in the 1980s and 1990s. We are now moving back to building some new SROs. This is an example of a project in Portland, a contemporary project in Portland with 60 units, 40 of which are SRO units. I also want to talk a little bit about cottage clusters. The idea of a cottage cluster, I think, is a set of small micro houses or on a lot. And the image on the left is actually in a multi-dwelling zone. Portland has allowed clusters of fairly tightly organized homes in multi-dwelling zones for probably about 10 years now. But the recent, our compliance project to get us into conformance with House Bill 2001 has brought us into the territory of expanding that into the single dwelling zones. I included a picture here of a small cottage cluster community in Sioux Falls, just to point out that this is a nationwide thing, not just something that Oregon or Portland is doing. But we're in the process now with our second phase of residential infill to allow cottage clusters in single dwelling zones by right without a planned development or some kind of design or conditional use. So I want to talk about how this kind of all fits together. There's a lot of different, when people talk about a village of tiny homes or a village of small cottages, it's something that comes up a lot when we talk about the housing, the shelter to housing continuum. And I just wanted to provide a little roadmap of how we see that continuum playing out across our different zoning code categories and types of buildings. So on the shelter side of things, we allow outdoor shelters where there might be a village, if you will, of tents or sheds or vehicles or yurts. If that kind of arrangement as a community service use had actual buildings in terms of, or actual dwellings, we would probably regulate it as a short-term shelter, but it's still also allowed. And then moving into the more commercial category, we do have examples of campgrounds and tiny house hotels and short-term rentals that involve sort of village scenarios. And those are generally regulated as commercial lodging if the tenure is less than 30 days and people are paying guests as opposed to receiving services or being there as clients. And then on the residential side, that plays out as, if it's not a building, if people are living in tents or sheds or vehicles, then that might be occurring as an RV park. If it moves up into actual buildings, but maybe the kitchens aren't in the building, then it gets classified as group living. And then when you move up into a cluster of tiny houses, which have each within them the full kitchen and bathroom, then we call that a cottage cluster or a planned development. And so there's this whole continuum of allowances in the code that allow these different forms of essentially what people would see as a small village of very small accommodations on that continuum from shelter to housing. And I'm just showing this slide because most zoning codes, I think, probably have some version of this kind of arrangement, but some in many cities, some of these cells are not allowed or just not provided. And so what we're trying to do here is provide that full continuum from shelter up through formal housing in at that scale. I want to close out my presentation with just a few questions. As I've been working on this, I've asked, group living is housing, and we in Oregon have requirements for there to be clear and objective standards for housing, but most zoning codes still treat group living as a conditional use. And I think that's interesting. A lot of the challenges to cities that don't have clear and objective standards for housing have focused on transportation or environmental criteria. And I'm just posing a challenge, I guess, to this group in particular about why not talk more about group living. The second question is just on the shelter end. I'm asking a similar question, which is that in most zoning codes, shelter is seen as a community service category, not housing, and it's not in the residential use category. And so most cities don't have clear and objective standards for shelter because it's not necessarily seen as a goal 10 issue, it's something else. And I think that's interesting. And as someone who's been working in this continuum for a while, for the last few years, I think that it's a question we should be asking is whether there needs to be a push statewide for clear and objective requirements for shelter. So with that, I will stop sharing and pass the baton on.
Great. Marc, Fretz.
Terrific. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor to join you and discuss these important topics. So yeah, I'm with the Institute for Health in the Built Environment, which is also connected to the Department of Architecture. But our structure of the Institute, just a little bit about who we are. It's a group that was launched 4 years ago out of some labs that have been around much longer, in some cases 4 decades of work in the Energy Studies and Buildings Lab on issues of energy and climate, focusing on passive heating and cooling and daylighting and ways to reduce our energy footprint. So we're bringing together a really large collaborative group to address issues in a way that we couldn't get at individually. And to that extent, we're focused on health, not just individual health, but health at multiple scales, health of communities and health of the planet. And so we focus on microbes and molecules at the small end, all the way up to carbon and energy at the really global scale. And so we have a network of external labs too we work with, and an industry group called Build Health that helps us frame better research questions and then apply these findings out into the community. So we all know that we have some serious issues that we need to address: climate, housing, health, equity. We don't need really any graphs or charts. We can just drive down the street and look around. And it seems like every year we keep setting new records, whether it be record drought or record heat last summer, record rainfall, record wildfires, even creating their own weather patterns. These images you see in this slide are just a few blocks away from our Portland campus. So, this is right outside of our own doorstep. And we know that these are things that we have to address and think systematically about when we do address them. So Eric showed an image of actually the site right here that was part of the Milwaukee Cottage Cluster study in 2019 that kind of prompted my interest in this. I was fortunate enough to be a stakeholder advisor as part of this group for the site that's pictured. This was led by, Metro, the regional government in Portland, funded this study for the city of Milwaukee to start thinking about cottage cluster housing to be in compliance with House Bill 2001, and also to make this typology actually work on most properties that are currently zoned for single family. So it was led by Cascadia Partners with support from Opticos from the Bay Area, Orange Splot, and ACG, and really tried to look at several different typologies of lots of sites in Milwaukee and figure out how this might actually be done and look at some different cost models associated with it. Around the same time, Provost Phillips at the University of Oregon challenged us to not only be the University of Oregon, but for Oregon. And we agree with that completely. And we wrote a proposal that received seed funding from the university to work with collaborators in architecture, law, business, and landscape architecture to explore new models of housing and resilience. So what I want to talk about today is just the work that we're doing to try and develop a new form of housing that integrates these cottage cluster models or mixed missing middle models of housing with some potentially new construction typologies. Professor Kevin Vanden Wijmelenberg, who is in the Department of Architecture and director of the Institute for Health in the Built Environment, was the lead for this effort. And he and Paul Ward, a researcher in our energy studies lab, led a class in Eugene looking at how we might add other layers of affordability and sustainability onto these community responses. And at the same time, Professor Judith Shine, also in the Department of Architecture, used a student design studio to test some of these ideas in urban feasibility studies with this lot in Milwaukee, as well as a 7-acre parcel in rural Staten, Oregon, and focusing on cottage cluster housing in particular, using a new product that was developed in Oregon, and it's from Freres Lumber in Lyons, Oregon, called Mass Plywood Panel, or MPP. And what came out of the studio and the seminar and our other cross-disciplinary work that we did as part of the Resilient Seed Grant was that we had a collective understanding that we cannot solve these issues of housing, climate, and social justice as disparate parts. We really need to think holistically and radically rethink the way that we use the land and the way that we develop housing and the type of housing that we develop. We know as part of the climate response that we need to take, we have to sequester a lot of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and forests are a big part of the solution. They have the ability to sequester and store that carbon in biomass in the soils, and also they have the ability to produce human shelter resource needs. But we need to consider the forestry carefully. We've been interested in this new product called MPP because we believe that it can help balance both of these needs. One of the things about the product MPP is it can be made from small diameter logs that are harvested from suppressed second growth forests. And that way we can convert that carbon into a long-term storage product to keep it sequestered in the built environment, as opposed to, say, paper that is very short-term and gets thrown away and doesn't store the carbon long-term. So we've been working with this material because it's got some carbon climate advantages, but also these small trees can then be converted into big panels. In fact, this is the Freres plant in Lyons. These panels can be as large as 48 feet long by 12 feet wide by a foot thick. And that panelized product opens up some new unique opportunities. In fact, the MPP can even achieve some of the structural attributes as another wood panelized product known as cross-laminated timber. However, sometimes those structural attributes come with 20% less wood fiber due to the use of veneers. So we're excited about this material. It was supported by the Tallwood Design Institute to help them receive their APA certification back in 2018, and it's kind of unlocked a lot of opportunities. With the panelized nature of the housing that we're investigating at the scale of single family or duplex, even row housing, multifamily, we believe that there are some advantages that come with that versus stick frame that we're exploring. So a few of those would be speed, the reproducibility and economies of scale of prefabrication, reduce material usage because we would leave a lot of the layers of a traditional stud frame wall off, like gypsum board, for instance, and paint, and just expose the wood as a finished material. And we believe there might be some energy advantages that we're exploring with a more monolithic wall envelope, not as many seams and joints, better fire resistance, and also just biophilic impacts for the occupants inside. At the Tallwood Design Institute in Corvallis, the Emerson Lab, they have some of these really high-tech machines, robots, and CNC cutters that we can test a lot of these ideas with. And we're working to even see about how we can integrate different bio products such as wood fiber that's been turned into insulation and can also be milled as part of these panels so that we can use a lot of the waste wood fiber which is the bio-based resource, into the housing itself and lock that carbon away into a long-term product. In addition, we thought, what should we be doing for affordability, sustainability, and resilience beyond the actual housing structure itself? And the notion of clustering housing or denser infill development allowed us to start thinking about urban design moves that would provide zero carbon mobility options around the neighborhood, opportunities for more biking, walking, and just social interactions, which we can all badly use right now after 2 years of Zoom, I'm sure. So these infrastructure models make a lot of sense because we're using the land more efficiently and we're bringing people and services closer together. Another layer is thinking about the affordability of energy itself and monthly outlay for those expenses. So we started thinking about, when we plop down a cluster of, say, 10 houses, what can we do with that grouping that we couldn't do with a single family house itself? And one of those ideas was to add solar renewable microgrids that would link these houses together, and where maybe not all of the houses on a site could receive sunshine, some could, and some could then share that with the others in a peer-to-peer sharing network, which would allow us to add battery storage and shared EV charging to help drive down the costs that way and provide more resilience by including these distributed energy resources across an energy grid. So in addition to eliminating the carbon emissions from traditional, carbon-based fuel sources, we believe this resilience is also really important to guard against natural or human-made disasters. Another layer is water, which may not seem like a big issue in the Pacific Northwest, although the last few summers have been pretty dry, but we still have a global shortage of clean potable water. And furthermore, water sanitation has a carbon and energy footprint and an infrastructure cost that impact affordability and resilience. So we've been working on systems of waste and water that we could layer onto these clusters as also water microgrids to help improve resilience and drive down overall development costs with the units. So I want to talk a little bit about the housing project that we have. It's a pilot project in Milwaukee that grew out of the feasibility study. If I have a little bit of extra time, I'll show one extra project that's a little different but uses the panelized technology. So this is a concept rendering of one of the mass plywood panel units, showing really just the beautiful nature of the wood interior finish, using that material as the finish itself. We have an extensive project team associated with this. We're committed to collaboration. We're addicted to it, one might say. In fact, we're working quite a bit with Oregon State. So, the Ducks working with the Beavers. We're actually calling it the Platypus Alliance through the Tallwood Design Institute to really focus on the mass timber aspect. So as I mentioned, Professor Judah Shine, the Director of Design at Tallwood and also in the architecture faculty, is really leading this effort together with Professor Kevin van den Wijmelenberg in the Institute for Health and the Built Environment, and with me. Oregon State is a big player for the engineering and testing of the materials and digital fabrication. Swinnerton has deep mass timber construction expertise and a proven record in project delivery. Timber Lab, also structural engineering and digital fabrication. Ferreira's Lumber for the material. And then Homework Development is a woman-owned development enterprise here in Portland that's really focused on affordable housing. And we're working with them to develop this model in Milwaukee to make sure that we can get the pro forma to work and use this as a model to test our design assumptions. We're focused on missing middle housing, so 80 to 100% AMI for this project. And currently, we're on track to achieve that, but there's still a lot more design to do. And then Providence Health is part of this. They've contributed to this project and recognize the need for the non-medical determinants of health to play an important role in their patients, but also the need for this type of housing for their own employee workforce. So I'll show a couple of plans. These are still in development, but this is a 2-bed unit concept. This is currently, what you can see here is it's configured in a row house configuration, but we also have plans for standalone units and duplexes and quads. We're moving away a little bit from the row house configuration just due to the extra cost requirements for fireproofing in those units. So probably we'll focus less on those for this particular development. But what you can see is, a simple 2-bed, 1.5 bath model. This is the first floor. Here's an image of the second floor, and really trying to provide this product to the market, which is badly needed. Doesn't really, there aren't many 2-bed, 1.5 bath ownership models out there in the region. So focused on that. For the site, we've explored a few different options. This is one of our cottage concepts where we wanted to really preserve the existing trees that are on the site. There's some beautiful legacy trees, walnut and chestnut trees and cedars. So that was a high priority for us, and also to provide a lot of shared green space so that families could send their kids outside and really make everything more livable. However, in this particular concept, you can see that to make it work, we were meeting the massing and footprint requirements, but the duplex cottage units are actually not permitted. They need to be freestanding single family units. So this one didn't work. We did explore what those might look like with freestanding cottage units. And the issue with this is that there are, of course, more wall surfaces exposed, which increases the energy use of the units and also the construction costs. And we also had more spaces devoted to parking on the site and removed a lot of the trees in so doing. So we also lost overall number of units on this concept. So we've moved away from this one a little bit and currently are focusing on the middle housing code that Milwaukee is debating right now and hopefully getting ready to adopt. But this particular configuration still preserves a lot of green space and has opportunities for some off-street parking, a lot of on-street parking, and gets us to a total of 10 units on the first site, 6 and 4 on the other 2 sites that we've kind of brought into the project. And we have one other site that we've brought into the project, which is a little different configuration. This is a more rectangular or regular site. We have another site down the street, which we brought in, which is 80 feet wide by 300 feet deep. So a little more challenging to develop, but a couple options there. So for this particular project, we're looking at about 34 units or 33 units, I believe right now is the current count, to really drive the affordability. And it might look something like this. This is a current rendering that Simone O'Halloran, our GE student, did. And so you get the sense that there's a lot of kind of shared green space to make these things work. Furthermore, this concept really draws on the MPP for everything from interior wall partitions to doors to really develop this. And there's a lot of upfront design costs to do it that we're using grants to fund. But once this gets developed, we want to make this publicly available to be able to make the models available for developers to use and really use the MPP for a lot of the cost savings throughout. So I do have, looks like a couple of minutes. I want to share one other project. So this project is less about adding new housing to our urban environment, but really focusing on protecting the housing that we have and making it more climate and seismic resilient. It's based on a model that was developed in Holland called Energiesprong. And the idea is to really take a leap in energy savings and really not just kind of, work around the edges, but really make big advancements in our energy use in buildings, in particular housing. To do that, and they're using a lot of prefabricated systems to cover the facade with more insulation. One of the issues on the West Coast anyway, is that we have not only some climate zones that could benefit from energy upgrades. A lot of the housing, pre-1990s housing, doesn't meet current code. A lot of it has low insulation, if any, and it also doesn't meet the current seismic code in Oregon, a lot of that pre-1990s housing. So we are interested in focusing on where those two zones overlay and trying to combine energy upgrades with seismic retrofits and use a material that's more bio-based, more focused on the embodied carbon of the upgrade itself, and not just on the operational carbon of the retrofit after it's been done. So we've got a unique opportunity to combine those. We're working together with Oregon State again on this project to use mass plywood panel, also in a very small 2-inch section, and use more digital workflows. So this is a picture you can see of a little mock-up that we have at Emerson Lab in Corvallis, where we've used LiDAR to scan the existing building and then develop those panels based on that digital model, and then use the digital fabrication tools of robots and CNC machines to mill panels that will be attached to the existing facade with more insulation and seismic restraint. So we're getting ready to do that this coming week for the final steps. And I hope to have more to share on that project later, which will be on our website, buildhealth.uoregon.edu, as we develop it. But in any case, we need to focus on both existing and new housing, we believe, to really address the climate and resilience issues that we all need to think about. So with that, I'll turn my screen back over.
Thank you. And our final panelist is Marc Jolin. So Marc, take it away.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Marc Jolin, I see him as pronouns. And as Ariana said, for the past 6 years, I've been the director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services for Multnomah County and the city of Portland. It's an honor to be here. I think I want to start out by acknowledging Eric. As I was listening to his presentation and thinking back over the past 6 years, when the Joint Office was launched in 2016, there was no legal pathway either on the land use side or the building side, really, for alternative shelters or shelter villages. We had a couple of sites that had come up essentially as protest camps, Dignity Village and then Right to Dream, and we had them and they were operational, but we knew early on in the work of our local Ending Homelessness initiative that we needed to diversify the shelter offerings and create a vision around this sort of outdoor shelter model that we could actually proactively build in this community and support in this community, and frankly fund, right, bring public dollars into, because it complied with the requirements of code. And so much of what Eric laid out in his presentation has been built by folks at the city of Portland over these years, and it's notable just how far we've come in this work. So Eric, a big thank you to you and your team on the city side for the countless hours that went into getting us to this point. So the Joint Office of Homeless Services is not a developing entity. I am not someone who does land use and zoning for a living by any means, nor do I do development. We're really tasked with investing public dollars in solutions to homelessness and houselessness in our community. And that runs the gamut from street outreach services to get connected to people and help them get connected to resources, to a range of shelter options that we can talk some about here, and then ultimately connecting them to the resources that they need to get back into housing and stay housed. And it's not just the folks that are in the tents that we see in the pictures so often. It's families with children that are doubled up, parents that are fleeing domestic violence situations with their children, youth who are coming out of foster care. So it's folks who are experiencing houselessness in very different ways often, but have in common the need for permanent housing that they can afford and that meets their support service needs on an ongoing basis. So that's our work, but it does mean that we're actively engaged in the issues of housing affordability and shelter capacity every single day. And our work always begins with the question of how do we best meet the needs of the people who are struggling with housing stability, who are sleeping out tonight, who are in a shelter but can't find permanent housing. What with the limited resources that we have at our disposal can we do to maximize the number of people who we serve well enough to ensure that they're able to transition successfully back into permanent housing and stay there? And I say that intentionally in terms of serving people well enough, because sadly, in the world of homelessness, we have many more people who are in housing crisis and in need of our services than we have dollars available. It's gotten better with the Metro Support Housing Services measure locally, but this is a crisis that has been with us for 30 years, and we have a lot of work to do as a country, as a state, and as a local community to truly address it. So in the meantime, we are always in a conversation with our community about, given the resources that we have, what level of investment are we going to make in the different strategies that we know we have to fund, whether that's outreach, shelter, housing placement, or housing retention, keeping people in the housing once they're there. And that goes to some of the really important questions that I think are more policy questions related to the discussion topic here today, which is, as we look at shelter, what is the function that it plays? Given the function that it plays in our system of response, what are the investments that we need to make? What is the standard of care that we need to provide? Given that as we make those investments, we are inherently making trade-offs. And similarly with housing, what is it that we need to provide to meet the basic standard that we set as a community for what it means to be in permanent housing? There are costs associated with those things when we meet a certain standard. Those are dollars that aren't going to serve the folks who are still outside or are still in dangerously doubled up situations. So that's in my world of homeless services, looking at our budget. When I think about shelter and I think about housing investments, that's what I'm working with, and that our community of providers is always working with. So that's just sort of by way of overview, and I'm going to share some slides on my side. Some of this you've seen now, so I'll go quickly, but I'll try to illustrate some of the thoughts that I was just articulating. My apologies, it's going to take just a second because for some reason I'm not seeing. Okay, there we go. Hold on. Let's try it again. All right, so hopefully folks can see that. And I will actually do it in share mode. Nope, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry. Slideshow mode. So Eric mentioned it. I want to talk a little bit about the modernized single room occupancy model of permanent housing. Talk a little bit about some of the modular work that's happened. Motel conversions, it's a big conversation right now around the country and in the state. We've been doing some of that in Multnomah County. I'm going to talk for just a minute about the long-term rent assistance program that we have, because whatever we're doing to manage costs on the development side, for the people that we are talking about trying to serve who are experiencing long-term homelessness with serious disabling conditions, they are generally extremely low income, meaning they have 30% or less of area median income. Often it's 0 income or 12 or 15% because they're on long-term disability. So there has to be a way to buy down rents in the units that we're creating. And then we'll spend some time talking about Village as a form of shelter. So Eric mentioned it, that we've begun bringing the SRO back, modernizing the concept of the SRO. This, in addition to the one that he showed, is one that just opened. It's called Finley Commons. It's got 35 units, 21 bedrooms, and 15 SROs. When the City of Portland and the Joint Office collaborated on this project, we're bringing the service dollars, and the City of Portland brought in the various construction subsidies. We had no long-term vouchers to put into the project other than some VASH vouchers, which are focused on chronically homeless veterans, but not enough for the entire building. And so what we asked the developer to do is think about, using SROs and how low could they get the rents in the SROs. And they were able to come forward with a pro forma that had the rent set at $500 a month, which is not affordable to someone who is living on SSI necessarily, but puts it in the range of some things that someone might actually be able to manage, who's on a fixed income or has very limited income. Subsequently, we were able with the Metro Supportive Housing Services measure to bring in long-term vouchers that I'll talk about, so that everyone in that building today is paying 30% of their income towards rent, regardless of what that income is. But the other really important thing about this project was the partnership with the faith community, and increasingly the faith community leaders are kind of galvanizing locally around how to use their property in support of a range of shelter and housing options. So this is one where St. Mark's Lutheran Church designated part of their parking lot to allow for this development, and the city, Eric can speak more to this, but the city has made that increasingly possible to do. And other projects, village projects, St. John's Village, for example, that Eric mentioned is on a piece of leased property belonging to a church in the St. John's neighborhood in Portland. In terms of how well people are served in SROs, that is a question. It's been an interesting topic of debate, and I think it's an important one to have. There are definitely people in our community who feel strongly that an SRO isn't an adequate standard of housing for the people who we're trying to serve, because it doesn't offer a private access to kitchen and bathroom necessarily. On the other hand, if you talk to the folks at Do Good Multnomah, they're very intentional about using the fact that folks have shared amenities and are more reliant on common spaces as a way to build a sense of community and a sense of connection. And they're also cognizant of this perhaps not being the place that someone lives very long term. It's permanent housing in the sense that they don't have to leave, but they build into the programming the support to help someone say, you know what, I've been here, I'd like to move on, I'd like to find another type of unit for myself. And so I think it's going to be something we're all looking at very carefully, because we are bringing SROs back. They are more efficient in terms of cost, just in the production side. But ultimately, if they're not serving the people living in them well enough, then they may not be the best investment of dollars. So it's something that we're working our way through right now in Multnomah County. The modular conversation, again, I'm not a developer, but there's always a lot of talk about, can we be using modular models more than we currently are? This is an example of using it for actual permanent housing. It's something that Transition Projects put together up in the Kenton neighborhood, opened during the pandemic at 71 units. And it's a mix of 1-bedrooms and SROs. They got their development cost to $175,000 a unit. I think they went into the project, as I understand it, hoping they could get costs quite a bit lower. But at the scale that this project was developed, I think they found that the hard costs of construction weren't that much lower using modular. Where they did have cost savings was in the reduced amount of time it took to put the project up. But again, because of the way this was built out and some cross leveraging, frankly, of units that are subsidized with vouchers and some that are not, they were able to offer the SRO units up at $300 a month, accessible to some of the folks that we're talking about who have those very limited fixed incomes, and their SRO units. So it's a similar kind of intentionality going into community building in that project, just like in the Finley Commons. So now let me talk briefly about motel conversions. This is something that's going on again around the country, and California kind of led the charge during the pandemic of acquiring motels and converting them first into non-congregate shelter, because we all had a need to get people who were high risk of severe illness or death from COVID-19 out of our large congregate shelter settings and into something safer. And so in Multnomah County, in response to the pandemic, we initially block room leased 8 different motels, over 350 units, rooms. And then as the sort of resources began to become available to acquire motels, including through the state's Project Turnkey effort, Multnomah County bought one. It's the one that you see here in the picture, 43 rooms. It was once upon a time a Motel 6. It's in the Gresham, in the city of Gresham. There are actually 2 other Project Turnkey motels in Multnomah County that were purchased by partner nonprofits. And we have since then purchased one other ourselves. Metro bought one that we're using, and we've got another 137 rooms under contract at a large motel that we're using as shelter now and planning to acquire. So this is a powerful way to add shelter capacity very quickly. That is definitely the case, and it offers a certain kind of shelter that, especially for the adult population, in many cases, at least in Multnomah County, we had not previously offered, but the pandemic made it necessary. I will say that as a model of shelter, it's quite expensive, and there are definite cost efficiencies to larger congregate sites. It goes into staffing models and other operating costs and so forth. But there are definitely subsets of the population of people experiencing homelessness for whom this is a good shelter model and a good investment in their sheltering needs. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We've used motel shelters in Multnomah County for families for some time. The interesting sort of conversation about the motel conversion from my perspective really has to do with sort of how you envision both the short-term and long-term use, because in the short term, these motels are there, they're easy enough to get into. We can definitely use them for shelter. But a lot of these motels are at the end of their sort of useful lives, or at least close to it. And so as we've gone in to acquire them, we've tried to be very clear in our own minds about what it is that we are investing in. Are we buying something that is just going to be shelter and then it's going to be torn down and redeveloped for permanent housing? Is it something that we want to start out with shelter, convert it at relatively low cost on interim basis to studio apartments, again with the intention in maybe 10 years to tear it down and build housing? As it turns out, we have all of those going, right? So we have a Metro acquired property that we're only going to run as shelter until Metro is ready to redevelop that land. We have others where we're thinking we're actually going to convert these into apartments, and are talking to some firms about doing that. And then others where we think it's going to be housing for a while, and then it's still going to get taken down and redeveloped into long-term newly developed affordable housing. And it all comes down to the condition of the property, right? It comes down to sort of how much you're going to make an investment in the capital, sustain that use over time. So those are I think for communities doing this, the really important considerations as you look to the motel conversion strategy. I said it before at the beginning, but I can't emphasize enough the regardless of sort of how we're coming at the housing development side of things, it doesn't seem feasible to develop true housing, right? That has electricity and plumbing and a kitchen and a bathroom, or even SRO housing at a rate that gets you to rents that are low enough for our lowest income and most in need people. And so as we're doing all of this development, it's been incredibly important for us to not only have the federal long-term rental subsidies from Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, but in Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas County, we now have this Metro measure resource, and we're in the process of allocating thousands of long-term rental assistance vouchers that look like Section 8 vouchers, but are a lot more flexible, easier to use, more inclusive than housing choice vouchers. And we can both project-base them, connect them to units in buildings, and give them to individuals to go out in the market and find housing options. So now the village-style shelters, and I'm going to run out of time, but this is not new. So Dignity Village was founded in 2000 and has been going strong in Northeast Portland for a long time. But really, they were just kind of living under the radar and serving people with a self-governance model. Now we have this list of sites in existence and 6 more safe rest villages to come, and a number of other sites as well that we're working on with other community partners. And Eric did a nice job of laying out sort of what these villages look like and serve. But I think from our perspective, they are shelter and not housing, which means that they serve a different function than permanent housing. They're intended to be limited duration stays. They're providing safety off the streets, right? Just basic safety from the elements, access to hygiene services, things that all of our shelters do. But when we look at them in terms of the investments we're making, what we're looking at is, are they serving people who otherwise wouldn't be served in a congregate setting, right? That's one question, because we need our shelters to accommodate the range of needs that people have. And if you take a site like Kenton Women's Village, it does just that. We created the Kenton Women's Village because we were hearing from people on the street and outreach workers that there were women who needed shelter, but they simply could not come into the congregate shelter options that we had for women at the time for any number of reasons, right? And we do a lot to remove barriers to congregate shelter, but some barriers we just couldn't remove. It was that need for that individualized space, the control over their own space. So we created Kenton Women's Village, and all of our villages are intended to serve that kind of a subset of the population, in part because although there's a lot of conversation about villages being potentially less expensive, they're not, in fact. In fact, in some respects, they're considerably more expensive. So that sort of who do they serve, what role do they play in our community is important. And then the other measure of shelter is how many people successfully transition out of them and back into permanent housing, right? Unlike permanent housing, where the measure of success is stability, shelter, it's really about our people moving through your shelter program back into housing effectively. And the village model lends itself to that if it is creating a better sense of safety for people. And if we're also able to connect people into the services that they need. Where there's some risk is if people come into those into the villages and treat them as permanent housing. And so we're having to be very intentional as we build these programs out to make it clear to the folks coming in that yes, they have a sense of privacy here, but this is not their long-term living situation. We're working with them on a housing plan from day one that helps them transition to something better. Eric covered a lot of this, so I'm not going to spend time on it. And I just talked a little bit about some of the programming considerations. I will say that in this village conversation, it's often seen as something that is a quick solution, get it set up quickly, use porta potties and temporary infrastructure. That's all fine unless the site is going to endure for any significant period of time. Those temporary investments, whether it's portable bathrooms or portable shower trucks, those things are less expensive in the short term, a lot more expensive in the long term. So as a city and a county, we've been pretty committed to building out the necessary infrastructure to reflect how long those sites are actually going to be there, whether it's a 2-year or a 5-year or a longer type of investment. That's hugely important. Takes a little longer to get them built, but once they're built, they're much more sustainable from a financial perspective if we've been intentional up front on what those ongoing costs are going to be. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, panelists. There are several questions in the Q&A, and as a reminder for audience members, you can put a question in the Q&A in the bottom menu of your Zoom screen. I think this is a good question for everyone. From Ellen Mai Galloway, she says, it seems like there's some positive reasons for tiny homes, cabins, cottage clusters, etc. Are quicker and less expensive construction. They're usually 1 to 2 story buildings, which are still lower density options compared to multi-dwelling taller buildings. What are your thoughts about long-term land efficiency of those options? And are they planned for long-term or temporary options until needs for density increases further?
Well, I can take a first pass at that if you like. This has been something that we've been focused on as part of our work with the feasibility study in Milwaukee and work with the neighborhood, stakeholders, because we're really trying to balance livability, quality of neighborhood life together with density. And in our model, we've actually increased the density quite a bit. We've gone from one home to 10 on one site and 1 to 14 on another site. So we're still adding a lot of density, but we're really being careful about the vernacular and the scale of the existing housing to make sure it fits into the scale of the new housing to make sure it fits into the existing neighborhood. So yeah, we could increase density more, but we would of course have much more resistance, I'm sure, from the neighborhood stakeholders if we built it out at a higher density. So we're trying to just really balance that livability aspect with the designs that we create. And we still have more density than we would have had by far, and much more green space that that we're trying to incorporate.
I guess I would add from the city side, we're trying, especially with our latest update to our residential infill code, to provide options for this across the spectrum of density, right? So to allow the cottage cluster model in a single dwelling zone as an option, but then have more urban versions of that in our lower density multifamily zones. We have had a few situations in our higher density zones where proposals have come in that just don't meet our minimum density requirements, and that's going to be maybe true in central cities or near high capacity transit and things like that. But generally across the spectrum of multifamily and single family zones, I think there are versions of this that work.
And I'll just add, I think on the shelter side, the villages, this is absolutely an issue in terms of kind of how much land we have to devote to how many people who are being sheltered. So if you take what were called our C3PO, there's these 3 outdoor shelters that we created during the pandemic. I said you might have seen a picture of those white, what they're called pallet shelters. That's a full city block that's being devoted to 40 some people. And that what that means is that's going to be a temporary use, right? That lot is going to get redeveloped, and that was clear in this case. Prosper Portland let us use them. But when you sort of have a known limited duration amount of time, right, you're all of those capital investments that we're making in the connection to sewer and water and electricity and so forth, you're amortizing those over a very short amount of time. And so as we think about shelter and its role, and it's a temporary place for people to be, we do balance sort of the investments we're making in places that we know we can stay long-term and that help us serve as many people as we can, as well as we can, with some of these conversations about, a village environment, which if it were permanent housing or cottage cluster, it might be a more appropriate investment. But if it's going to be something that is a low density shelter that you're not going to be able to justify the kind of land consumption over time, then you might think differently about how much you want to prioritize that resource investment.
A question from John Sarninski. These critical issues should be constantly integrated with the notion of community building, of which housing is a part that can best be applicable in a large context neighborhood making. Public entities with the support from planning and sustainability commissions and design commissions are really the only entities that are capable of enforcing these goals, and what can we do to support meeting these goals?
I'll take a run at this from the perspective of people who are experiencing homelessness and for whom shelter is the short-term need. I mostly would ask that partners are really understanding that. I think Eric raised this, shelter is sort of used as community service, not as housing, but that when we're building shelter, we're building space in the community, in the neighborhood, for people who have no better alternative than to be in shelter. And so often we face resistance from neighborhoods who feel like a shelter is a burden or is something that is going to be a problem. But if you treat shelter as something that is not a necessary and integral part of every community, because you have people who have no choice but to use shelter, you essentially exclude them from the community that you're saying you're trying to build. And so we've been really intentional about insisting that shelter is appropriate in neighborhoods, on commercial districts, where we've been very resistant to any efforts to push shelter to the margins of community, because pushing a shelter to the margin of a community means you're pushing the people in that shelter even further to the margin of the community. And these are already some of the folks who've been marginalized most in our neighborhood. So this is, I would just ask that you view shelter, whether it's a congregate shelter or a village type of shelter, as a necessary part of building a community that's meeting the needs of the diverse housing needs of all of its residents.
I'll use this as an opportunity to tie back. I think you mentioned, Marc, earlier the importance of the faith community in some of this work, and I think from the city side, that's been a key tool in helping to get deeper into community and overcome some community resistance to that full range of housing and shelter. And we've tried to really look at how zoning codes limit faith communities, especially because they do have that land base. A lot of faith-based institutions have large parking lots that are used once a week, maybe, and that's been a key. There's a lot of energy in that community to help solve this problem, and I think it's an important partnership because government can't do all of this.
Andrea Pastor asks, looking at Shelter to the Housing Continuum project, and given the number of people living in their vehicles, is there a conversation around adding RV parks in the city?
I know one of the Safe Rest villages is aimed at RV shelter, I guess. I'm not sure that's the same thing as an RV park. We did do some rezoning to protect existing RV parks, but I'm not aware of any specific conversation around building new RV parks at this point.
And I think this is a question for Marc Fretz. Sam Huck asks, with PPP, is there no need for insulation? Also, how are wires, conduit installed and maintained?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is still a need for insulation. MPP itself has some resistance, thermal resistance, and it has minimal, but you do need to add additional insulation to the outside of that wall assembly. And so one of the things we're looking at, is using bio-based wood insulation that could be kind of a composite of that assembly. But also there are opportunities for adding more mineral wool insulation, which would be more fire resistant in fire prone areas of the state. And then by doing that exterior insulation, you create more of a monolithic thermal envelope. So you help reduce kind of the thermal bridging that occurs across the wall. There is a lot more design work that has to happen up front because of you mentioned the MEP services, the electrical conduit and plumbing. For instance, we've got one wall panel that is stud frame, so we can run all of those services and kind of keep them closely coordinated and condensed to save money and to save wires from being strewn everywhere. But we'll have some surface mounted conduit for sure in these units.
Jennifer Brager asks, how should mental illness be addressed in light of Boise and the Grants Pass case in combination with the desperate need for shelter? Understandably, we connect the inability of criminal justice system to perform, e.g. the need for criminal defense attorneys, the lack of Salem Hospital to adequately serve the needs, and burnout in the social services sector. What sort of out-of-the-box solutions are you considering?
I appreciate, I'll try, I appreciate the question and the reflecting back all of the ways in which the different systems are failing and leading us collectively to this point where we have so many people struggling with really serious behavioral health issues who find themselves on our streets. I have two sort of, I think, thoughts on this. One is the need for mental health services and addiction treatment services is enormous. and there's a lot of work to do on expanding access to those types of services in this state. I think we rank 46th or 48th out of 50 states in that area in terms of access. But we know that even folks who are really struggling with those types of disabling conditions can be successful in housing if they're in housing that comes with the necessary level of support services. If we don't have to provide that service out on the street or in a shelter unless we don't have a permanent housing unit for that person to go into that has the necessary services connected to it. And that's why so much conversation is happening right now around the need to expand supportive housing, right? Housing that is deeply affordable. The rents are affordable to somebody who has no income or just an SSI income. And there are really intentional and appropriately scaled support services that really meet the needs of that particular individual. So whether in Portland, we've got the Bud Clark Commons, which is some of the sort of highest need housing we have, and then we have a range of other supportive housing that is perhaps less intensively supported for people whose needs aren't as high when it comes to the support services. I don't know that it would fit in the category of out of the box, but that we know from all of the data, including, if you think about it from a cost perspective and cost avoidance, that when someone is still experiencing homelessness and struggling with behavioral health issues, they're cycling in and out of jail, in and out of the hospitals, in and out of our shelter systems. The services are not connecting. Once we have someone in supportive housing for a period of time, all of that utilization drops down significantly. Now they're not going to crisis psychiatric care nearly as often. Now they're not getting arrested now, that right? And so we've got to stay focused as a community on that supportive housing model and expanding that as much as we can. In the interim, for those folks, while we're building that out, the out of the box, I don't know if it's out of the box, but we're bringing behavioral health services to people while they're still on the street. We're designing programs, and they're expensive and they're smaller than our big congregate shelters, but they're 25 people or 40 people. They're motel based, or we have this behavioral health resource center that we're building that's got a combination of congregate and SRO. But it's building a program model that actually works to sustain folks who have that level of acuity that we're seeing right now. So that will be our part of the response. And if we really want to solve this, we're going to have to get upstream and figure out how to get the other institutions working better to provide care before someone finds themselves on our streets.
And Marc, if you want to comment on this, because you're more the expert, but I've heard a number of times that it's not just behavioral health issues or addiction that causes houselessness. It's houselessness also triggers those behaviors and addictions in many cases. And so the plugging, just the role that housing plays in health stability overall, I think is important.
I guess I should mention that the Safe Rest Villages, for those of you who are not in the Portland area, the Safe Rest Villages are an initiative that is, it's 6 sites. They're outside village environments, in part because of the benefits we know folks glean who are struggling with behavioral health, often from having their individualized spaces. And the intention is to bring a more robust set of services to those sites because it's focused on that chronic population that's doing a lot of the camping and doesn't have a lot of supports right now. So that's part of the initiative with Safe Rest Villages, is to also expand in that area.
Here's a question from Heidi Hinshaw. She says, I perceive that there has been a lot of pushback from various jurisdictions against self-governance in these temporary or semi-permanent shelter villages. And she asked for your thoughts.
It's a good question. There are a couple dimensions. It's sort of there's a follow-up here, which is sort of pushback from where. I mean, on the one hand, we definitely hear pushback from some people in neighborhoods where we are planning to have a village type of shelter. Their concern is they want to be assured that operations will be professionally maintained, that there will be the necessary kind of management of the space to address their concerns that having this kind of village shelter or any kind of shelter is going to somehow have adverse impact on the neighborhood. So that kind of push you hear a fair amount. And there's, of course, these sites need, like any program, right, or housing development, there needs to be adequate management on site to address the sort of potential impacts that any apartment building or business or whatever could have on neighbors if it's not well run. I think where the difference of opinion comes in is whether folks, who are living inside of a village environment like this can successfully run it either on their own or with less support than sort of people often assume is going to be required. And that's really where the one dimension of the conversation goes, is sort of how do you kind of ensure, as a public funder in particular, that there is accountability and a level of sort of ongoing day-to-day management in a program that allows that program to function without a lot of regular intervention by you as the public funder, because we need these operations to be smooth, right? And of course, we're there for accountability, but we have multiple projects and multiple sites that we're managing, and we need the ones that we're investing in to have enough support internally and to be successful without us having to always be there to problem solve.
This is something that came up quite a bit in our zoning project. I'll add, just we got a lot of public testimony, as you can imagine, and there were a couple dimensions that relate to this. We tried very hard to keep operational standards out of the zoning code and allow the providers to run that aspect of that world rather than codifying specific operational standards into the zoning. But there is a lot of pressure to do that when you propose changes to codes. We also have some history in Portland of self-designated camps evolving over time into more permanent things. And so there was a great deal of fear from neighborhoods and all sorts of folks about, was this zoning reform going to allow a camp to just spring up organically in some park or neighborhood? And we tried to be very clear that, no, this was a zoning code to allow nonprofit entities to run shelters or government entities to run shelters. But yeah, there is that gray area there as you get into some of these questions of self-management and how that relates.
And I wanted to say one last thought on this, is that so what we're actually doing now is a sort of hybrid, right? We're looking to harness the self-governance capacity of the folks who are staying through councils and so forth, and because it builds a sense of ownership and belonging, and all of that's really important. But the other dimension that gets lost sometimes in the self-governance conversation is, absent some staffing and an organization that's kind of responsible, it ends up being that you can't bring as wide a range of people into the space, because it then requires anybody who's staying there to be able to participate in that self-governance in the way that community has defined it. And that's a limiting factor. So St. John's Village, for example, we really wanted women to be able to come in there for whom it was just a safe space, whether they could engage in that self-governance model or not. And so they've retained a council. The women for whom that's important are able to do that, but it's not a requirement of being there. And that organization can also manage conflict that arises when you have folks with higher needs sometimes in the spaces, and ensure that they're not having to be removed from the space in order to preserve the community. And that's the other piece of the self-governance tension. So that there's got to be a balance in these things as we put them in place.
And here's another question from John. Are there relationships between inclusionary housing opportunities and the larger context of genuine, sustainable, complete neighborhoods as related to temporary or permanent housing? As defined in the 2035 plan that includes vital, easy to support uses and spaces such as multi-use parks, walkable streets, schools, childcare, etc.
Yeah, I guess I can talk about that. Yeah, Portland's comprehensive plan, the 2035 plan, talks about our goal to create complete communities as we grow, and that includes a whole range of things around access to recreation, access to services, transportation, but housing and shelter, I think, are key components of that. I would say, yeah, a complete community is defined in part by whether it has that full range of housing options, and that probably needs to extend to shelter options as well. And Marc's program has been doing a lot to try and make sure that each part of the city ends up with shelter services, that it's not just concentrated in the central city.
Are there any questions the panelists would like to ask each other?
Awkward silence. So I don't have a question. I did note that there is a question from Al Johnson, on how Metro could address the growing gap in Black home ownership when duplexes and triplexes are mainly rentals. And I just wanted to comment on our own cluster development. That's something we're really focused on. There's just not a lot of opportunities to begin with for purchasing 2-bedroom, 1.5 bath units. And that's something we're trying to bring to the market. And then also allow, diverse communities to flourish there and build wealth, but also protect affordability over time. So those are all the forces we're trying to wrangle with as we go through that development process.
I think from my perspective, the home ownership aspect, there's two things that are in play there. Maybe one is just the effort to make land divisions easier at that small infill scale, and I know that there's been legislation on that, and cities are struggling to figure out how to implement that. But that's one aspect of it, is just making the fee simple ownership easier at that small infill scale. And that's a super complicated, wonky topic involving utilities and standards for easements and all sorts of things like that. And then just the condominium laws in Oregon continue to be an issue for that form of ownership, I think, in terms of just, we're still not seeing much of that form in Portland.
Eric, one of the things you mentioned was utilities, and that's actually something that we've been interested in trying to eliminate, actually having any site utilities where everything could be, I know utility companies don't like us to say off the grid, so we say grid enhancing, but renewable energy power that could be independent, as well as sanitation and water services that could also be independent. And it's kind of out of the box thinking, and policies don't seem to be ready for it yet, but there is the potential to generate water from air using solar panels that operate that, as well as the container-based sanitation that would allow us to not have to have all the big infrastructure question marks when you develop a site. But it's, I'm not the policy expert, and so I'll throw it out to all of you to try and think about those questions and how we might consider those in terms of rethinking housing, holistically.
Well, it looks like we're just a couple minutes until our time is concluded. So we'd like to thank you all for participating on the panel. And then we'll reconvene at 1:45.